Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am in the great church of Debrecen. So this is the second city of Hungary, also called St. Andrew's Church. So there's been a church on this site since at least 1200, and then a new one was built around about 1300, and it expanded very considerably. Obviously, it was a Catholic church in those days. All Christians in Hungary were Catholics. There was a small Jewish community as well, because King Stephen I had converted the Hungarians to the Christian faith around about the year 1000, though he was brought up a Christian. His parents had both been baptized sometime before that. Anyway, so this was eventually the largest Hungarian church east of the river Tisza, a river which bisected the Hungarian homeland. Having said that, obviously Hungary's lost a lot of its easternmost regions. They're now part of Ukraine, Slovakia, or Romania. Transylvania, northwest Romania, was part of Hungary until the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, a fact which still rankles for many Hungarians to this day. Anyway, so then it burnt down again in the 16th century. About 60 years later, they rebuilt it, and then it burnt down again in 1802. Reconstruction commenced in 1805 and was completed 20 years later. So it's quite plain but handsome inside. So this is a Protestant church. So it's the second largest Protestant church in Hungary. So Calvinism really took hold here during the Reformation. You'll see why there are no holy images, there are no likenesses of Jesus Christ, no stations of the cross, no crucifix, just a few crosses. You can see down there to the pulpit where the pastor or minister, whatever, would preach. You see this enormous organ which was fashioned in Vienna, presumably by a Catholic, but brought here. So business is business, or maybe just not being bigoted. Okay, even if he didn't believe in Protestantism himself, that wasn't going to prevent him providing music to separated brethren, all part of our ecumenical dialogue. And you can see the pews down there. So presumably it's great for acoustics. Look how high it is. Praise the holiness in the height. And I've yet to go up some of the towers. So it costs about 1,040 for a full tour of the place. And you can see some of what the exterior looks like there, with these towers, little domes on a few of the towers. And then the altar, as it was, to the east. Of course, they don't believe in transubstantiation, so communion is not terribly important, not something they do very frequently. So there's not much to distract you from the word of the Lord here. And there are a few artifacts to see. I might get around to showing you some of that. They've got one of the first Bibles printed in Hungarian, a copy of that first print run from 1590. Of course, because the Catholic Church wouldn't permit it in vernacular languages until then. And so you can see some hand sketches of that is what the front of this church looks like, the great church as they usually call it. And then there's that a Reformed college, as in Protestant college, just behind. So that was the centre of Hungarian Protestantism. About 20% of Hungarians were Protestant, Horthy Miklós being a famous example. So this has been a very important place, this church, in Hungarian history. So then there was the Hungarian Revolution in 1848. It was the 3rd of March is really when the revolution in Paris was completed. The news reached Hungary about 10 days later, and it inspired people. So Kossuth Lajos, he was from the countryside, not that far from here, and for some time he'd been advocating for major reforms, speaking the Hungarian diet, saying we should debate it in Latin, we should be allowed to do this in Hungarian. Also taught himself English, often by reading the works of Shakespeare. But that's why his English was larded with all sorts of archaisms. But anyway, what else about Kossuth Lajos? I don't want to retell the whole story of it, but initially the Habsburg government in Vienna granted what they wanted, gave all these concessions, partly because they thought they were powerless to resist. So if you can't beat them, join them. But they were then things changed in 1849, and they reneged on all these promises. So the Emperor Ferdinand had abdicated in favour of his nephew, Franz Josef. But unlike in most European countries, in Hungary, someone did not inherit automatically. The coronation was vital. Until you were crowned, you were not the King of Hungary. And then therefore the kingship was vacant. So I'm just going to go downstairs and show you some artifacts associated with that. And so war broke out. The Habsburg army was fighting against the forces of independent Hungary. Not all Hungarians were in favour of independence. And the Austrian army was not just those who were ethnically and linguistically German, included Slovaks, Czechs, Romanians, Serbians, Croats, and so on. And the Ban of Croatia, Jelacic, he had fought against Hungarian independence, even against the wishes of the Austrian government. But and then the Russians intervened in favour of the Habsburgs to try and keep the Austrian Empire together, because they thought this is a threat to legitimism. They can't have the Hungarians becoming independent, because that might inspire non-Russian peoples in the Russian Empire to rise up and strike for independence. Anyway, so I'll hopefully be able to show you a few of these artifacts. So they lost Buda and Pest, the Hungarian nationalists, and they fled here to Debrecen, and they made this their temporary capital. And so they'd been willing to accept the Habsburgs as a king of Hungary, Franz Josef, but no longer. They said that the Habsburgs had purged themselves of the Hungarian nation, had therefore they were abjured. They had no right to be king of Hungary. Franz Josef didn't, and Hungary was going to insist on absolute independence. There have been 12 demands they made in 1848, and in 1849 they proclaimed their 5 points. And here you can see some images for it. So the Hungarian parliament. Then it met here, and this is a handwritten minute of some of the debate, some images, and this is the chair of Kossuth Lajos. You see the wreath, the Hungarian national colours. You see there a copy of the Hungarian Declaration of Independence and so on. Anyway, eventually they're defeated by the Russians. They all had to flee. Some were caught by the Austrians at Arad, now in Romania, in October 1849. Some were executed by firing squad. Batyányi Lajos was executed in Budapest with a shot to the head. He was so weak from a suicide attempt he couldn't stand. Anyway, Kossuth Lajos managed to get free, cross the border into Ottoman territory. The British were quite friendly towards him. From there, he spent some time in London, where he was lionized by British high society. But Queen Victoria said, this is bad news, you can't be embracing a revolutionary. But certainly radical and liberal sentiment was on his side. It caused the government to fall, actually, and he addressed huge crowds, speaking in all sorts of archaisms, but using incredibly florid language. Anyway, he went to the United States, where he was feted, and he really began to spread his separatist ideas, and the Hungarian community there largely welcomed him. He was the second foreigner ever to be invited to address the US Congress, the first being Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis of Lafayette. Wish you could see closer, but those are dollars for the Hungarian fund, 1, 5, 10, 50 or $100 for the Hungarian National Fund for Americans, whether of Hungarian blood or not, to donate to this cause. So clearly it was a very significant place, and it was, I suppose, one of the largest buildings in Debrecen, somewhere they could actually have a meeting of hundreds of delegates. So you can see an image of other Reformed churches from around here. So that is showing you just how important this church has been in their history. And you can see a copy of the Bible in Hungarian from that 1590 edition, the first print run of the Bible in the Hungarian language. So the Austrians got back in charge. The Habsburgs had persecuted Protestants, and in the late 17th century, some Protestant pastors were sent to be galley slaves. And there's a memorial to them. Because, of course, the Habsburgs had a coast, the Austrian Empire had a coast, and John Paul II, that Pope, he came here in 1991, and he apologized for the way the Catholic Church had persecuted the Calvinists here. Right, so that's probably enough from the church here, and yes, it is in use as a place of worship. And there you can see what I was talking about, the altar, as it were, the pulpit, and so forth. So that's enough for me. I'm going to be able to go up the highest tower, so warmly recommended. Anyway, thank you so much for your donations of a pecuniary nature, and please keep them flowing in. I urgently need them to sustain the channel. It isn't easy affording all this globe trotting, and I do hope coronavirus comes to an end, and we can really normalize things and not have the headache of filling in a passenger locator form. Right, toodaloo, everyone.